Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. I'm Isabel and this is my spooky library. In today's video, I will be sharing with you my very favorite spooky Edgar Allan Poe short stories. Without a doubt, Edgar Allan Poe is the master of the short horror story. He writes gothic tales like no one else I know. I decided to dedicate an entire video to sharing with you my favorite Edgar Allan Poe short stories. There were so many for me to choose from, and it was hard to compile this list. So I went ahead with some of his best known stories as well as some obscure ones that I feel more people should know about. Before I get to my list of my favorite Edgar Allan Poe short stories that I think you should read, not just now in spooky season, but whenever you feel like it, I'm going to tell you a little bit about his kind of writing, what Edgar Allan Poe stories normally feel like, just in case you've never read one and you're wondering if Edgar Allan Poe might be the author for you. I'd like to start off by saying that if you love short stories that are set in a dark, gothic environment, many times catacombs, abandoned castles, dilapidated homes, Edgar Allan Poe might be the author for you. His settings tend to always be dark and dreary days where the rain hasn't stopped, and he does a wonderful job of just creating this incredible atmosphere that makes you feel truly spooked. In addition to gothic rooms and chambers and abandoned castles, another reason you might enjoy Edgar Allan Poe is because of his great character work. Most of his short stories feature a beautiful young woman who is plagued by some sort of mysterious illness, and undoubtedly she meets a devastating end. A lot of this, of course, is inspiration from Edgar Allan Poe's real life after he lost so many of the women he loved to consumption. He found it really difficult to separate his writing from his real life. So, if you also enjoy a writer that uses a lot of autobiographical details in his writing to create a truly, truly scary story, he might be the author for you. In addition, Edgar Allan Poe's prose is absolutely beautiful, and his poetry is pretty wonderful too. But I think I'm going to do another video about that. So, his prose is incredible. His language is filled with figurative words. He uses rhetorical devices in each of the sentences he crafts. His writing is filled with allusions to canonical works, to Shakespeare, to the Bible, to mythology, and it truly is such a rich experience to be able to dive deep into the works of Edgar Allan Poe. And the last thing I'll tell you about his writing before I dive into the stories I've prepared for you today is that he writes the best stories of obsession. Obsessions with ravens or cats or even teeth. Edgar Allan Poe knows how to write an obsessed, unreliable, about to lose it narrator. And if any of that sounds interesting to you, then stick around for the remainder of this video where I'm going to share 10 of my very favorite Edgar Allan Poe short stories with you. So, the majority of the stories I'm going to tell you about today can be found in this illustrated collection that I do have of Edgar Allan Poe's works. However, there are many different collections that you can find that do feature a lot of his stories. I believe maybe one or two of the stories that I'm going to share with you today are not here, but I will be using this version of my Edgar Allan Poe stories to walk you through each of the stories that I have decided to add to my list. So, the very first story I want to share with you is Bernice by Edgar Allan Poe. So, Bernice is unique in its narrative style because it does take place in a library. There is a lot of academic talk in Bernice, talks about the main character walking through his bookshelves, studying, learning. So, if you enjoy a short story that takes place in a library, in a personal home library, then this might be one that you really like. So, our main character falls in love with his cousin, autobiographical detail, of course, and he madly becomes in love and obsessed with her and proposes that they get married. And she agrees. And one day looks at her and sees her in a slightly different way. Maybe it's because she is plagued by illnesses and she's looking weaker and weaker than ever. But he develops this very strange obsession with her teeth. And that's really all I want to tell you about this short story. But if you enjoy stories of obsession, then this might be a story that you enjoy. And Bernice, I find, is not a super popular short story of Edgar Allan Poe's, and it happens to be one of my very favorites. So, moving on from Bernice, a story that is not super well known, I'm moving on to a story that is very, very well known by many, and that is The Telltale Heart. I first remember reading The Telltale Heart like in middle school, and I think a lot of students, that is their first experience with Edgar Allan Poe, and that is the story of The Telltale Heart. And ironically enough, I do find that this is one of the pretty violent, gory, bloody Edgar Allan Poe short stories. And it just has so many vivid, vivid moments. So, in this story of obsession, following the fact that we just learned about the obsession of Bernice, this is another story of obsession. And in this story, we are following a caretaker who provides assistance for this elderly man that he lives with. And he is basically his caretaker. And he's a wonderful help to the old man. He assists him in all his needs. But one day he becomes obsessed. And he becomes obsessed with the eye of the old man. And he starts to feel like the old man's eye is cursed or is possessed, and he must do whatever it takes to rid himself of this eye. And obviously, what proceeds is another story of monomania or obsession, and the extent that the narrator is willing to go through to rid himself of the eye forever. And it is pretty bloody. It does make comment about culpability and people's guilt, and it's a wonderful, wonderful short story. The next story that I want to talk to you about is The Mask of the Red Death. So, The Mask of the Red Death takes place in this lavish, lavish castle where Prince Prospero and a group of his rich friends have locked themselves in for the duration of this bubonic plague, black plague, pestilence that is attacking the world they live in. And so they decide that they're going to lock themselves in with every possible pleasure known to man. And they have the most exquisite of foods, and they have these masquerade balls, and every night is dedicated to them celebrating being alive and escaping death. And little do they know that amongst the guests in this masquerade is the Red Death. And my favorite part of the short story is its beautiful imagery, is the commentary of how death comes for all of us and we can't really escape it, and we should just embrace it and understand that there's nothing we can really do to avoid dying and avoid death. The fourth short story that I want to share with you today is not found in this collection, and that is the short story Hop Frog. Again, this is another lesser known Edgar Allan Poe short story, but one of my favorites. So, Hop Frog is pretty much a jester or an entertainer who works for the king. Basically, part of his entertainment to the king is allowing the king and his men to make fun of him. And they poke fun at his deformities, they poke fun at his small stature. And Hop Frog, a name cruelly given to him because of the way he walks with a slight hop, both he and Trippetta, another one of the small companions of the king, both of them are asked to perform and drink and made fools of right in front of the king and his men. And Hop Frog has pretty much had enough of this. And the story Hop Frog is basically a story of revenge, where Hop Frog finds that he is tired of being made fun of and pushed and abused along with Trippetta, and they make a plan to exert their revenge on the king and his men. And this is such a elaborate kind of plan, and we can't help but root for Hot Frog and Tripetta and hope that no harm befalls them. Speaking of stories of revenge, I move on to a very famous story of revenge of Edgar Allan Poe's, and that is the Cask of Amontillado. So, the Cask of Amontillado is also not just a story of revenge, but follows a character dressed as a jester. So, in this story, we have two characters, Montresor and Fortunato. And Montresor and Fortunato, although friends, have a lot of rivalry. And Montresor has felt like Fortunato has ridiculed him and made fun of him and been unjust and unfair to him. And he gets tired of it. And he one day wants to seek his revenge. So, in the premise of flattering Fortunato and his knowledge of Amontillado, which is a type of wine, he lures him to the catacombs in order to carry out his plan of revenge. And this story has so many memorable moments, so many memorable lines, and the descriptions of the catacombs are truly, truly terrifying. The sixth story I want to tell you about today is The Black Cat. In The Black Cat, we are following a narrator who has spent his entire life bonding more with animals than with people. And eventually, he does find a partner to share his life with who loves animals just as much as he does. And they both have many pets, but among their favorite is their black cat. And so, our narrator, who indulges in drinking often, another autobiographical detail, comes home one night slightly drunk, and the cat, who would normally greet him and caress him and be close to him, stays away from him. And so this angers him because he feels that his pets were the only beings that never shied away from him or rejected him. So once he is rejected by his black cat, he gets very angry and he takes it out on his cat. What follows is a lot of incredible, incredible details that the narrator continues to try to convince us are not figments of his imagination, but things that are actually happening. And this one does have a lot of violence and bloodshed on page. So make sure you check out the trigger warnings for the Black Cat. The next story I want to tell you about is The Pit and the Pendulum. The Pit and the Pendulum is basically a story that discusses the fear of the unknown and the dangers and frights of torture. In this story, we are following a man who wakes up in this incredibly dark room where he can barely see anything. And so he starts to try to figure out his way around the room or figure out where he is. And the first incredibly scary part of this venture is that he starts to hear this like squeaking sound. And the squeaking sound is coming from the rats that are everywhere in the room with him. And as if that were not terrifying enough, he starts to see that there's something descending from the ceiling. And that something pretty much looks like a pendulum that is swinging back and forth and getting lower and lower and lower toward him. And that's really all I'm gonna tell you about this one. But it's definitely an entertaining, claustrophobic kind of read. Story number 8 that I want to share with you is The Fall of the House of Usher. This one is slightly longer than the other stories, and it is incredibly, incredibly popular. In this story, we are following a narrator who was a childhood friend of Roderick Usher. And he goes to visit him as he has heard that Roderick and his twin sister Madeline are not doing well with their health. So, upon arriving to visit them, he discovers that they are living in this dilapidated castle. This castle is pretty much falling apart. And so, once he walks in, he starts to realize how frail and weak both of the ushers are. and he starts to see that they are plagued with illness, and they are plagued with what feels to be like a curse. And he starts to get enraptured by the ushers and the illness and the house, and he starts to lose a little bit of his sense of reality. This is pretty much a story in which the setting mimics the reality of the people living in it. So this entire fall of the House of Usher is indicative of the fall of the Ushers. So we have these incredibly beautiful metaphorical comparisons between the house and the twins that live inside it. And that's really all I want to say about this one. But this one has great atmosphere, great talk about textures and the entire atmosphere of the house and its setting. And it's almost a character. The house is almost a character in and of itself. Story number 9 cannot be found on this version of Edgar Allan Poe short stories. It is called The Oblong Box. And this is not a well known short story, but it's one that I really, really love. And in this story, we are following Wyatt and Wyatt's friend, and Wyatt is an artist who has boarded this ship, and he has boarded the ship with this oblong box. And he's there with a box, and he's there with his wife, and things seem a little bit strange. I mean, when people see a box, they want to know what's in it, right? I think that's such a basic trope, like what's inside the box. I mean, since Pandora, right? We all want to know what's inside the box, right? I mean, it's been, eons of people wondering what's inside the box. So clearly, when he's on the ship, everyone is kind of wondering what's in it. And obviously, he's an artist, so he talks about having a painting in the box and he's storing that. But there are a few things. He seems to be acting a bit strange. His wife is unusually out of character, like she's not behaving as people think she should. And so this is pretty much one of Poe's kind of detective stories, and that's why I wanted to include it in this list. I feel like most of the short stories that I did include in this list were pretty much his gothic horror stories. And although this is horrific and has some horrific revelations, I feel like it's pretty much one of his like mystery stories where we want to solve the mystery of what's inside the oblong box. And I highly, highly recommend it. And then the last tale that I want to share with you as a part of my list of favorites is a little bit of a cheat. I could not make a list of my favorite Edgar Allan Poe stories without including this. And I almost did because it's not really a story, it's a poem. But it's telling a beautiful story, a spooky story, a scary story, a story of loss. So my number 10 is a bonus because it's not actually a story, it's written in verse, and that is The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe. So The Raven is one of the most beautifully written tales of love and loss and the afterlife. In The Raven, we meet a speaker who is sitting at home, lonely, thinking of the woman he lost and loved, and he's drifting in and out of sleep, studying his books of forgotten lore when he hears a rapping on his door, right? And there's a raven that is rapping on his chamber door. And that's pretty much all I'm going to say about this. The beautiful rhyme, the lyrical words, the incredible amount of allusions to both the Bible and mythology and Shakespeare is just what makes this tale so, so beautiful. And it also gives you a little bit of a taste of Edgar Allan Poe's perfect rhyme and how he can include so much emotion in his works. And it's just, I had to include it in this list. And that's why The Raven is number 10 on my list of tales or stories of Edgar Allan Poe that you should read. So there you have it, guys. I have shared with you 10 of my very favorite Edgar Allan Poe stories. These are all stories that I have read many, many times in my life. I do not get tired of reading these. I think that they are beautifully scary. They talk about some of the scariest of things, which is loss and loving things and people and being scared of losing them and our fears of what happens after we die. Yeah, it explores so many of those things that make us human. And I think that's what makes Edgar Allan Poe such a wonderful author. And I know a lot of us reach for him in the spooky season, or we reach for him when we're trying to find a scary classic story, but Edgar Allan Poe's writing is definitely something everyone should experience at least one of these stories in their lifetime. This is pretty much my list of 10 stories. I would love to hear if you've read any of them. Do you have others that are your favorites? I mean, there's so many, right, that I didn't talk about. Do you have other favorite Edgar Allan Poe stories that would have made your top 10 list if you were doing a video like this one? I would love to know what your favorites are. And if you've never read Edgar Allan Poe, did I convince you to pick up one of his short stories? I hope I did, because he is truly, truly a master of Gothic writing. So this is it for my very spooky video. I still have a lot of spooky content planned for the month of October. I know I have started earlier, but you guys know I love me spooky time. So I promise I will bring you more spooky content the rest of September and during the month of October. If you made it this far in the video, thank you so much for watching. I appreciate you. Please make sure you subscribe to my channel. It would mean the world to me. I will definitely catch you in the next one. Bye!